is your video for Luke chapter 6 from Calob from Father Dyer. So in Luke chapter 6, Jesus has begun his public ministry, and we begin to see him have confrontations and encounters with a religious group called the Pharisees. If you haven't heard of the Pharisees before, the Pharisees were a religious group at the time, not necessarily leaders, although they had leaders, but ordinary folks for the most part, who were very into their faith. And particularly they were into the rules of their faith. The Pharisees had rules about most everything, what you could do and what you couldn't do. And we are going to see Jesus encounter this group and have a confrontation with them again and again. And we see that here at the beginning of chapter 6. So Jesus has gathered a group of people who are following him. And we'll see here in a bit, he calls some to be leaders of that group, the disciples, and they're hungry. And it's the Sabbath, a day when you were supposed to do no work on the Sabbath. And they are plucking grain, assumedly to eat somehow, although if you've ever tried to eat raw grain, it's not very fun or filling or enjoyable. But they're plucking this grain on the Sabbath because they have to. And the Pharisees are like, Jesus, it's the Sabbath. You know your people aren't supposed to be doing this. And then Jesus tells them a story from the life of David. And you can find this in 1 Samuel 21, verses 2 through 7. Again, that's 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 2 through 7, where David, who Jesus is descended from and was eventually going to be king of Israel, is on the run and his followers are hungry. And so they eat this bread that you really weren't supposed to eat in the temple, place where you probably weren't even supposed to be. And what Jesus is getting at in this story, and what he's getting at in the next story too, is that people come before rules. That caring about people comes before rules. And Jesus really pushes this in the next story, where they are in a synagogue, and it's still the Sabbath, and there's someone there who has some sort of physical disability. And Jesus has this whole thing planned out where he's like, I'm going to show these Pharisees what's up. And Jesus asks them this question: is it better to do good or do harm on the Sabbath? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. And if Jesus asks you a question, there's probably not a right answer that you can give and, get away with it without getting a lecture or a teaching. And that's the case here. So Jesus heals this person. And then he tells them, the Son of Man, i.e. Jesus, is Lord of the Sabbath. And what Jesus is really driving home here is the same thing he said in those fields. People over rules. This is a lesson the church still needs to learn. We love our rules. What's right, what's wrong, who's in, who's out, what you do, what you don't do, how you do it, how you don't do it. And Jesus here is like, no, forget the rules. It's about people. This whole thing is about people. Now, what comes next in verses 12 through 16 is Jesus takes some time for himself, as we've seen him do. He takes some Sabbath time. He has to pray and go and be away by himself. And then he chooses from his followers the 12 disciples. So we don't know how big the group is that's following him, but he chooses 12 from that group. And then they're named. And, you can find some song to help you memorize those if you really want to. Of note in there is Judas. Judas is part of the group. Everything the disciples do from here on out, Judas is part of this core leadership group. So just keep that in mind as the story continues. And then in verses 17 through 49, the rest of the chapter, we have what's known as the Sermon on the Plain, which is similar but not exactly the same to the Sermon on the Mount that you can find in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And so some of these teachings are parallels, are really close to teachings that you find in the Sermon on the Mount, more famously known, but here it's called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. And Jesus starts off this teaching in verses 20 through 26 talking about blessings and woes. Blessed are X. And then the counter comes a few verses later. It says, woe to the opposite of the people I just mentioned. For example, he says, blessed are you who are poor. And then later on he says, but woe to you who are rich. Now, it's hard to hear Jesus say, whoa. We love the Jesus that says, blessed are these, blessed are you, blessed are, everybody. We don't like the Jesus that says, woe to you, especially if it's you he's talking about. But what Jesus is getting at here is that the message he has come to proclaim, the kingdom, the reign of God that he is showing us in real time, is a system of values that is completely flipped from the values that the world has. Because the world says, blessed are the rich and woe to the poor. And Jesus says, no, complete opposite, yo. Woe to the rich, because what are you going to do with all that? All that stuff's meaningless anyway. But blessed are you who are poor, because God knows what's up. And so Jesus here is flipping the values and the expectations of the world, because they're completely opposite from the values that God is calling us to. And that is really the theme through this entire series of teachings, through the Sermon on the Plain. In verses 37 through 42, Jesus talks about don't be judging folks. And again, we love to judge folks. Oh, we love it. We do it. And Jesus says, don't do that. Show mercy and you'll receive mercy. Show grace, you'll receive grace. And then he has this wonderful teaching where he says, he uses this analogy of your eye. He's like, you have a plank, like a 2x4 in your eye, and your neighbor has a speck. And you're going to call the speck out before your own 2x4? No, work on yourself. And what Jesus is saying here is like, don't get caught up in worrying about others, because guess what? There's plenty of work to do right here. The person in the mirror is who you can really work on and worry about them. Devote your energy and your talents to yourself and making yourself more righteous and yourself closer to God, and let other people work on themselves. Because guess what? When it comes down to it, this is the person I can really work on. This is the person who I can really change and transform. I can't change and transform you. Jesus can. I can't. You can. I am the one that I can change and transform. In verses 43 through 45, Jesus gives what I consider to be his wisest and most applicable teaching, where he says, you will know them by their fruits. And when he says them, he means all of us. That good fruit comes from good trees. Bad fruit comes from bad trees. What Jesus is saying here is like, look at the result. Look at what comes from someone or something. And that's what you can really make decisions on. Is something putting more love in the world? Is it making people feel closer to each other or closer to God? Is it meeting some need that people have? What is the fruit that is coming from this? Is it good or is it bad? And that's not immediately apparent. Jesus chooses this parable wisely because fruit just doesn't show up. You don't plant an apple tree and boom, there's apples. It takes time. And so Jesus is saying, pay attention over time and see what really comes from something or someone or some agenda or whatever it is you're trying to evaluate. Now, Jesus here is talking, he's talking about, who do you follow? What values do you have? Whose teachings are you going to follow? Mine or someone else's or something else's? But I believe this is a teaching that's applicable to literally anything you're trying to decide. Look at the fruit, the results, what comes from it, and choose those things that are life-giving. Now, Jesus follows this up and he concludes the chapter by telling the story about two foundations. About a guy built his house on the rock and it stood the test of time. Floods, wind, whatever. The house stood. Someone else built a house on the sand and it done fall apart. And this is related to the fruit story, to the fruit parable. Because Jesus is saying, the fruit that comes from my teachings, the fruit that comes from the teachings of Jesus lasts. It bears good fruit. It stands the test of time. It endures. And the other things that we can choose to base our life on, the other things that we can choose to pursue, won't. They will crumble. They will not last. They will not endure. And I think that's one of the most important themes for us in our lives and in our spirituality, is we are called to pursue those things that endure, to devote our time and our energy to those things that are eternal, those things that truly last, those things that bear good fruit. because there is so much that doesn't bear good fruit, might even bear bad fruit. There is so much that does harm. There's so much that does not endure. And there's a whole long list of those things that we could name: violence, addiction, racism, prejudice. All those things do not bear good fruit. And praise be to God, they don't last either. But instead, you and me, let's devote our time and energy to the teachings of Jesus, to the path, the journey, the connection, the spirituality that is solid, that will last, and that bears good fruit. Let's be merciful. Let's show kindness. Let's treat people the way we would want them to treat us. Let us bless each other so that we can be blessed, to then be more of a blessing to others. So friends, as you read Luke chapter 6, be mindful of those ways that you can bear fruit in your life. Be mindful of those ways you can build your life on a firm foundation, the teachings of Jesus that endure and lead to the way of life. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow for chapter 7. Peace.